Welcome to this episode of Mosaic Days, where we talk about all things education, including student achievement and outcomes, professional development and training, and IDEA and impact, and imperative. I'm your co-host, Leonard Martinez.
And I'm Allison Smith.
What do we have on our agenda for today?
Well, as you can see, don't you love it? I love it. This is our celebration. We've got our full happy 50 years to IDEA. That's ultimately what it is. It's our celebration. IDEA, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, is officially 50 years. And their birthday was yesterday, November 29th of 2025. So that's what we're here, is to celebrate 50th birthday.
Are they supposed to whistle?
They should be making noise. Wah, wah. I know, it's not really festive, but we're celebrating 50 years of IDEA.
Is there cause for celebration given the current state of the Department of Ed and OSEP and the politics and the funding? Do you want to give us a little history of IDEA?
Yeah, IDEA is definitely one of those laws that they say was crucial in the civil rights movement in the sense that it provided opportunities for students with disabilities. So previous to when IDEA rolled out, it actually was students were educated in a separate environment. So they were not allowed to be a part of their public school environment.
And this built on the momentum from Brown versus Board of Education, right? I mean, this was basically founded in the civil rights movement that was occurring with Dr. King and moving those forward. This was kind of built on that momentum, right?
Yes.
And this was 1975 when Ford...
1975, President Ford signed into a law, and it started out as Public Law 94-142.
We're supposed to all memorize. It's PL something through something.
PL 94142, the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. And so, ultimately, it has been reauthorized multiple times. And so in 1990 was when it officially changed to IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Now, when I recall from my schooling, right, when we took coursework, I thought IDEA needed to be reauthorized every 5 to 7 years. We haven't had a reauthorization in a really long time. What do you think that is?
2015 was the last time they had the Every Student Succeeds Act that was amended, IDEA at that point in time. But ultimately, there was reauthorizations in 2004, 2015. It has not been like a consistent reauthorization. Yeah. And then the question becomes, what ultimately has it changed? And so I think today we're going to really look at 50 years. Great achievement. 50 years is definitely is an achievement. But what ultimately has been done in those 50 years for our students with disabilities, I think that's the important thing that we're going to talk about today.
So this was a federal law in 1975, 50-year anniversary, really talking about educating students with disabilities in a public education setting.
Yes.
I would imagine back then, especially for the more moderate or the more moderate severe students with moderate severe disabilities were probably not going to school at the time. They were being either told that we couldn't accommodate them in the classroom. They were probably at home. They might have been in separate schools. They might have been in institutions. So this was really a landmark law that said, hey, let's introduce this concept of least restrictive environment. Let's introduce this topic of FAPE, this free appropriate public education, which are the hallmarks of special education today.
That's correct. And then over the years, it's really focused on that early intervention and the focus on, making sure that we're identifying students early and getting those early intervention services moving. Plus, it's looking at, special education, but all other related services as well. So I know that you and I were just talking and you had marked down, just the different components of IDEA, just in terms of what it actually does. And we've had conversation about that a number of episodes ago when we talked about, OSEP, which is the Office of Special Education that ultimately is supposed to oversee IDEA. Yeah. And so in thinking about those 50 years, what has happened, I would say?
It's a good question. I think, again, it was landmark at the time. I think they had a lot of good ideas of pushing equal rights forward. I still think we have a lot of work to go, but it did lay some foundational work for, currently what we're doing now, right? We try to keep kids in the least restrictive environment. We try to make sure that we make some database decisions on services that they're receiving. We start talking about IDEA as a funding source too, though, right? And I think we think doing research, it was supposed to comprise 40% of the allocation for funding, for spending. Has never really fully funded to that 40%. Not 100. When we talk about fully funded, right? We never think that they're supposed to provide 100% of the funding. Fully funded means the 40% that they were going to dedicate to fund special ed. We've come nowhere near that. I think I've read some spots that said 12 to 15% is what they covered. And unfortunately, this puts an undue strain on states. It puts the undue strain on local education agencies to cover that. And that's what we've been hearing, right? The general fund, the local contribution from an LEA is making up for that part that the federal government never has provided for us. Yeah.
Well, and what we had talked about with OSEP and kind of removing OSEP, what does that ultimately do? Because the states are covering so much of that, not only financially, but also structurally. Because IDEA is supposed to provide us guidance in all things, every acronym known to special education, right? LRE, FAPE, so least restrictive environment, free and appropriate public education. You have your IEP, your individualized education program. And so, IDEA is supposed to do that. But again, this goes back to our conversation that we had before about with the removal of OSEP, the states are already doing so much, like we said, fiscally, support-wise, audit-wise, even looking at our disproportionality data and our IEP, timeline data. And so, IDEA in itself, our own state has kind of taken that. And although that is the guidance, we have our own ed code that ultimately tells us how to move forward and support students with disabilities.
Yeah, and I think what we talked about with OSEP and IDEA moving under Health and Human Services potentially, where is that going to leave state monitoring? Where's that going to leave the monitoring component, right? And I think we talked about California will probably be in pretty good shape. I mean, we are pretty stringent when it comes to compliance and monitoring and ensuring that students are receiving appropriate services throughout the state. I think other states might have some difficulties with that. I mean, it'd be a good thing to research how other states are with compliance. I think it might hit the smaller states more. And we talked about that because they might have limited funding at the state level to address some of the monitoring and compliance. So it's a wait and see. I think it's not going to change the way we do business in California. And we talked about this as advocates for children with special needs. We do self-monitoring, right? I mean, the state can tell me what the state wants to tell me as far as IEP monitoring and timelines, but at the end of the day, as a leader, we have to impose self-monitoring to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our students. And I think as long as you have that as your guide, then you're probably going to be good no matter what happens to the Office of Special Ed. That's been my standpoint. Now, if we're trying to cut corners and you're trying to look at leaning toward more fiscal responsibility than compliance, you're probably going to have some issues. And I think we're going to probably see some challenges through business services and fiscal, trying to say, hey, do we really need to do this? So I think there is going to be some questioning of interpretation and saying, well, do we need to provide this or can we provide that? So I think as advocates, that's where we come into play and say, well, this is what the interpretation is. This is what the spirit is. And so as long as you have that to guide your conversations, I think most districts should be okay.
Yeah. I mean, our focus really is on what's best for kids. I mean, so, unfortunately, as a leader, you have all of this coming up where it's fiscally this and, law this. And, at the end of the day, we're looking at what's right for kids, right? And IDEA is supposed to guide that. But I would say that wholeheartedly, I know that I personally am always looking for what is in the best interest of kids in terms of placement, in terms of, special education being a service and not a placement that you stick to 100%. And how are we going to get kids out and back into and incorporate? So, I think over the 50 years, when we look at that, there's been a lot of different models that we can talk about. There's been inclusive instruction. There's been, full integration. There's been a co-teaching model where you have special education and general ed.
And Where's UDL?
Universal design. Hey, I didn't get there yet. Your favorite, UDL. And so, in thinking about IDEA, I mean, would you say that was IDEA telling us in those 50 years to do all of those things? Or do you feel that was more district and state leadership, coming up with research-based models that have been successfully utilized for students with disabilities?
Well, I'd always say that a lot of the stuff that we're doing now, the movements that we're doing now, were born in special ed, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were the ones that were, in theory, supposed to be differentiating instruction, providing scaffolding, providing accommodations, providing multimodal instruction, providing classroom management and behavioral management strategies. We are supposed to be the experts in that. I don't know if we are the experts in that. I think, again, we kind of go back to providing ongoing support and training for our teachers and our paraeducators. But a lot of these ideas that we're pushing now, when you take a look at like the MTSS model or old school RTI or RTI squared, a lot of those roots, a lot of those foundations, a lot of those practices were really kind of based in special ed. And then we always say, if it works in special ed, it's going to work in general ed. Or good teaching is good teaching. Or hey, when we do these accommodations and these scaffolds in special ed, why can't the general ed students benefit from that way of looking at instruction? So, in theory, all of this stuff that we're doing now was born in special education. Now, are we effective in implementation in special ed and general ed? I would say we got some work to do. I think we got it. We'll talk about the dashboard, I think, next week. But the dashboard does inform us of how we're doing with some of these decision making and some of this implementation of instructional and behavioral strategies. So I think we have a lot of work to go. I think we've come a long way, but I think we're nowhere near where we should be when it comes to dealing with students with special needs and 504. Well, I'll throw that in there as well.
Yeah. Because ultimately, if we don't have the money to be able to provide the level of service that we're even talking about, we're talking about, additional adults and teacher training and teacher release days and all of this stuff. Fiscally, if you don't have the money to be able to provide some of those things, we're finding a lot of special ed teacher shortages. We're finding, students that are having to not be served in their districts, and we're having to pay to ship them out to other schools. I hate shipping them out as the term, but, putting them in a more appropriate setting that maybe is outside of the school district, which costs, a great deal of money. But we have right now over 8 million students served under IDEA. So that is really kind of the 2024, 2025 projections. The last that I actually found was 7.5 million as of 2022, 2023. So we've had a significant increase over the last few years. And so, we have to look at how are we going to be able to provide and fiscally support that level of student population in all of our schools across the nation.
Let's go back and talk a little bit more about IDEA and the way it's written. The way it's evolved. It's 4 parts to it, A through D. Part 1 is the general provisions. B really covers the educational part of it as far as school age. C is infants and toddlers. So weird. It's kind of backwards, right? We always say transition C to B.
Yeah.
But alphabetically, it probably should have been B to C.
It always confuses me.
That's just me. And then there's a part D, which is the national support programs at the federal level. So it's 4 parts addressed to really deal with birth through 22 and all the components and definitions about eligibility, the categories, some of the funding sources. So it's in that respect, it's a very holistic document that covers everything you can imagine. Sometimes a little gray for my taste, but at least it's all there. And then the states are responsible for adopting this into Ed Code. California, you can go more than, you can't go less than.
Yeah.
So this is the baseline for providing education with students with special needs. California does go a little bit above and beyond with some of these statutes and regulations, but that's basically what IDEA is.
Yes. And then within there's 6 main elements, right, that you had listed. So the individualized education program, the free and appropriate public education, which is your FAPE, your least restrictive environment, LRE, appropriate evaluations, parent and teacher participation, and procedural safeguards. So again, it's kind of just that foundational piece. And then the states have to kind of build from there, and like you said, it is very gray. So when you go and you look at something from IDEA, there is not a ton of text. that you're going through and you're actually reading through in order to, determine how best to support and interpret the law.
Have you taken the time to look at some of the statutes? So back in the day,
I have.
I told myself I was going to read through the entirety of the statutes and regulations. I probably got through about half of it, just because I wanted to see what was in there. I mean, it is a lengthy document, full of a lot of legalese, which isn't necessarily friendly to staff. Definitely not friendly to parents.
No.
But it is a fairly lengthy document that outlines basically everything there is to know about special ed. And so that's like, again, the founding principles, the idea that every kid should have this individualized education plan, talking about evaluation, talking about timelines. So a lot of it is very prescriptive in how you're supposed to go along through this process, who should be a part of that team that makes a decision, including parents in that decision making. So really kind of the checks and balances of what this is supposed to look like from the regulations and statutes to implementation at a school site. Again, we talked about the concept of free and appropriate public education. What does that look like? Like, what should a student receive while they're in education to benefit, to access their education? And I think, we talk about this all the time. Data-based decision, data-informed decision making, because we know, like, school districts get a lot of requests for one-to-ones. My kid needs a one-to-one. My kid needs a tutor. My kid needs that. And we have to go back and take a look at assessment and gathering that data to determine, does your kid need this? And then the counter argument is, well, every kid would benefit from a one-to-one tutor. It doesn't mean that the data supports that decision, that you should be, through the IEP process, that you should be eligible to receive that service. So, and then the other part of it is we got to take a look at what services are available to all students on campus, right? So there's a lot of schools that have tutoring services or after school programs that all kids should be able to access. So I always tell people, well, if you have a service that's available for all kids, then why are we putting that in an IEP if all kids can access that? So what additional supports does that student need per their disability? And again, me, over the past couple of years, everything has to be disability based. We have to make a decision on how that disability, whether it be a specific learning disability, an OHI eligibility, an emotional disability, how does that disability manifest on a day-to-day basis that impacts that student's ability to access education, to have appropriate social interactions with staff and peers, to safely navigate that campus. So how does that disability look as it compares to kids with no disabilities? And so if we take a look at that approach, then I think, to me, it becomes a little bit more clear on how students access services through special education.
Yeah. But again, that's not through IDEA. So IDEA is not telling you that is the process. I mean, that is ultimately up to leadership decisions, interpretation of the law, looking at IDEA alongside the California Ed Code, for instance. So I always go to IDEA, and then I always go over to CDE, because I have to see exactly what does that mean further for our state. And then up to that interpretation, for the two things put together, then there is some, individualized decision making that districts take in order to guide processes like that, and so, I would say IDA is really your starting point, but it doesn't provide you that level of guidance of what you really need to do in order to effectively run a special education program.
Now, do you think, and again, you're right, we don't get that level of specificity from IDEA, nor do we really get it from CDE for California, for where we're at. Do you think they should take more steps to at least provide some more guidance as to determining eligibility for services? You're really left to doing an assessment and then discussing the results of that assessment and making a decision whether the kid's eligible for special ed. Do you think the state should be doing more, or our OSEP, we talk about OSEP, should be doing more to give us guidance on determining some of these processes? I mean, because you're right, ultimately, the statutes don't give us a lot of specificity with that. The states kind of don't either. And so that's why we have, we could have a student in this district who's eligible for services. But if I take this student and move them to this district
Yeah.
with the same assessment, they might not find that same kid eligible for, say, APE or speech and language. Do you think we should have some consistent practice that's recommended by the state in order to determine service and level of services?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say that that's a state-based probably decision for our state to kind of do a little bit more of the guidance in those certain areas. And a lot of that is also up to reviewing case law and reviewing decisions, OAH decisions, and reviewing all of that and kind of coming into calibration, your favorite word, calibration, and making sure that counties are calibrated throughout the state of California, for instance, on how maybe we're going through processes for determining specific supports for students. I think for IDEA to do something like that, I mean, and we would have to do more research, I think, in other states to kind of see what exactly is happening across the United States. But just from the California perspective, there's definitely more steps than what you have in IDEA. But then I think California then should define that a little bit more and have a little bit more calibration across the state.
Yeah, here's a good example that always drives me nuts. Speech and language, right?
Yeah.
How in the world does a speech and language pathologist determine the level of service and the frequency of the minutes and whether it's individual or group based on data? And then again, I'm not an SLP by training, so if I'm wrong, I'm sure the SLPs can correct me. But you see twice a week, 30 minutes, pull out, small group. Twice a week for 15 minutes, individual. It doesn't seem to me very prescriptive. And this is the need of the kid. And this is the way I'm going to develop skills, whether it be in the classroom or a small group setting or individual setting. Is there a lot of guidance out there for
no?
And that speech and language?
There's no, but it's even with specialized academic instruction. I mean, that could be built based off of a student's schedule. Are we actually measuring what that student needs in terms of specialized academic instruction? Or are we building it around, let's say, their high school schedule, their class schedule, right? So, there is zero formula for what that looks like for speech, for OT. It's usually just, this is what I do. Yeah. And this child may need individual support. This child may need group and individual. This one may only need group. This one may need push-in. There should be some sort of guidance, I would say, for them to all come together, speech and language pathologists across the state, some determination, some formula, some, I don't know, chart showing areas of weakness. And then this is what is prescribed, similar to a doctor. You have an illness and this is the medication that goes and supports that.
But that might not be consistent either. That's a different.
I know. But I think, so much of that is really up for us just to determine district-wide. And then what are best practices for students with disabilities? Yeah. I mean, it becomes, there's a lot of interpretation. And so calibration, I would say, definitely needs to happen a little bit more.
Kind of some of the other components, confidentiality, transition services, discipline, all those are embedded into the IDEA to support our students with special needs.
Yeah. So I have a really cool fun fact for you. Okay. I put it down here. I call it a fun fact because it's interesting to me. So we're looking at this 50-year span. And in 20 years, from 1997 to 2017, there was an increase on the U.S. population of students with disabilities by 1 million students. Okay. So that's from 1997 to 2017. So 20 years. Right now, we're going to get an increase of 1 million students across the United States in a projection of 5 years. Okay. So when we look at IDEA, yes, it's come a long way. And some people are like, oh my gosh, look at all these students served. But doesn't that go back to maybe some over-identification, would you say, of students with disabilities across the United States?
I think we've broadened. I think we've broadened the description of what's happening with special ed in this country. We talked about last week. We talked about autism, right, and how the incidence rates have really been exacerbated by the way we identify students and how we place them on that spectrum. So I think there's factors involved that have inflated the numbers to where they're at right now. I think similarly, one of the things I saw was it was 10% not too long ago. Now we're hovering at 15%. So talking about that million extra students, we're talking about 10 to 15% since we've been in education.
Yes.
And I think we have to take a look at what's happening. Are we really placing students in the least restrictive environment? Are we looking at 504 plans? How much of an impact is the disability to access general education? When we came out of COVID, we saw an increase in requests for initial evaluations. But we always talk about this too. Prior to COVID, we started dealing with a lot of school avoidance, anxiety, and depression that we've never seen. And, of course, some people would posit, and I would too, that has to do with social media and the accessibility and the overdependence on society and social media and what that does to students at the middle school years and the high school years. So society's changed. A lot of the way that school-age children are interacting with one another and with adults have changed over the past 20 years. So some of that is accounting for this increase in identification, but 15% wouldn't fly 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It just they would say you're over-identifying students with disabilities, and 15% would not fly. That's going to be the new norm. And we got I got news for you. We got some schools in California, they're at the 20% mark or above. And so we really got to take a look at, again, intervention, general ed intervention. Everyone always says special ed spends too much money. We counter that by saying, stop identifying kids, put interventions in place, put evidence-based practices in place so that we can serve these students without identifying them for special education.
Yeah.
We start doing this, right?
Yeah.
That they're pointing at us for spending all the money. We're pointing at them for not having the appropriate interventions to keep that door not wide open.
Yeah. And
so what we've seen over the past 20 years now is that door that was at that 10% now is think about it, 10% and adding another 5% of that. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Percentage-wise, it doesn't seem like a lot, but that is quite a bit of an increase. And so what are we doing? We talked about it, we're celebrating IDEA. It's important, it's landmark, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done as educators, as administrators, as leaders, as parents, as community members. All the educational partners have to come together to figure out what are we doing to support students so that special ed isn't the answer. And I'll tell you right now, special ed isn't the answer for everyone.
Yeah.
And so what are we doing to create those processes and those interventions so that we can support all of our students on our campus?
Yeah. So I, obviously in work in 504s, that's also something that I think schools are not really that familiar with. And I think parents are not that familiar with 504s either. I think there's a lot of communication that needs to happen and some training that needs to happen both for school staff as well as parents and guardians around the benefits of 504s, because I think it's kind of a mystery for some people. And they feel that if their child is on a 504, that they're going to receive less support than what they would receive in an IEP. And oftentimes you'll find that students, they really do not need the level of service that an IEP offers, and that a 504 with certain accommodations and supports is going to be sufficient for them to be successful in the general ed setting. And so I think school sites are just quick to say, okay, let's just test, instead of taking the time to go through a proper eligibility evaluation for a 504. I mean, you could start there. And we've talked about, even in California, how the 504 numbers are incredibly low as well.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some awareness around there. Now, everybody says COVID. At some point, COVID has to not be the reason to blame all of the increase in numbers.
Well, it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Are those requests for initial still occurring, right?
Yeah.
And especially, and we saw it a lot at the high school level. But if we're saying COVID was just a one-time event, then in theory, now that we're 5 years out of COVID now, those requests for initials should be less frequent. But I want to get back to the 504 really quick. When you hear the mythology of 504 is IEP light, or 504 doesn't have the teeth that an IEP has. And those are the things I've heard in my career, as I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
We've made it appear less than an IEP.
Yeah.
And so when you're a parent and you think your kid needs support and you're saying 504 isn't as as meaningful as an IEP, and that's the misconception of it, then why would I want this? I want this. I don't think the state does a very good job to support us with looking at 504 plans.
Yeah.
Again, the ed code says we need to exhaust general ed interventions prior to consideration for special education. However, OAH has been pretty clear: do not delay. Even though, so we don't get really a lot of support in that, because technically speaking, if you ask me as a parent for an IEP and I review the data and I say, well, I don't think we should assess, I could issue you a prior written notice saying I'm not going to assess your kid because your kid doesn't look like there's an existence of a disability because of the records. The grades are great. Teachers are saying the kid's fine. But when you take a look at some of the decisions that have come out of OAH, they don't support that. Mm-hmm. They say you got to assess. Mm-hmm. So I remember back in the day where LAUSD was doing prior written notice. We're not going to assess. We're not going to assess. We're not going to assess. They've been hit so hard with OAH on failure to assess. Now they're assessing everyone.
Yep.
So the mechanisms that are supposed to support school districts that are in place, that are part of ed code, they're not being enforced the way they should. And therefore now we have a lot more assessments out there. And if we take a look at students are behind, then you could take a look at the discrepancy model or patterns of strength and weakness and find these kids eligible that you might not find eligible.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but the 504 is very clear. And I think that if you go through the process and you look at the data, there's only so much support that a 504 can provide, right? You're not having specialized classes. You're not having specialized academic instruction. You can still receive services through a 504. But in terms of that, like actual case manager support, and that's ultimately what parents don't want to release, is somebody checking in on their kid. But that's why it's so important and so crucial to have a 504 coordinator within every single district to make sure that they're monitoring students and their progress. And so if they're happening to be slipping, then we're going to call a meeting together to provide next level support. That's really not happening. But you also don't have the next level of timeline support where you are obligated to assess every single year. That doesn't occur with a 504. You have to do a review and you have to check to make sure. But nobody says, like an IEP, that you have to hold a meeting within 364 days. So a lot of parents don't want to release that, but again, that's our job to go back and figure out what is in the best interest for a child. What level of support do they need? Because just having a plan that a child is not using is not helpful either. And you find that a lot in special education.
Yeah. And as these numbers increase, where are we getting all these teachers from?
Well, that's a big issue.
Going from 10 to 15%, that increase requires additional teachers.
That's correct.
Special ed teachers, additional special ed paraeducators.
Yep.
Potentially additional psychologists and speech and language and all the other related services.
Yep.
If we're increasing, and you're saying the trajectory is we're going to continue to increase, how are districts able to find teachers to fill those vacancies?
Well, we already have a shortage. So we already have a special ed teacher shortage. And now we're going to have to, as we're increasing and the projections are moving up and we're continuing to increase in our special ed numbers, alongside declining enrollment, you're going to need more special ed teachers, less general ed teachers. But we already don't have enough special ed teachers to begin with. So we've also, I came up with also another number that basically says that all of the complaints within the state, the written due process filing complaints have increased just in the last few years as well, due to a number of classes that maybe are not supported by the right level of teacher or the right credentialed teacher. So there's a lot of issues still going on. And I guess the question is how do we incentivize this maybe for educators to go into special education? How do we prevent special ed teachers from leaving the profession? That's the quickest, teacher to burn out is special education. There's lots of issues that I think are still there. So we can celebrate our 50 years of IDEA, but I wouldn't necessarily say that we are in the right place.
And then we just talked about the assembly bill that recently passed, which is going to take a look at possibly reducing class sizes even more, which would necessitate more special ed teachers and staff. So,
so I'm leaving the profession. I'm out now.
You can't get back here. Not going anywhere. Not going anywhere soon. I mean, the bottom line is it's important work. We have to advocate for our families, for our students. We have to make sure that they're receiving the right level of support in the classroom. And so it's very challenging work. It's very frustrating work. I could see why people leave the profession. It's not the easiest job to do. You have to manage students with learning needs, students with autism, students with other health impairments. You're dealing with so many different disabilities and characteristics of those disabilities. And honestly, I don't know if we do enough training in the training programs to support our students. And we definitely don't. We definitely do very minimum training of our paraeducators. So it is not the easy thing. It's not the easiest job in the world. It could be the most rewarding job in the world for sure. You can see growth. All students can learn. And so it takes dedicated professionals and dedicated leaders and dedicated parents and dedicated community members to ensure that we take this 50 years, we learn from it, we continue to improve student services. But we got a lot of work to do still. We're nowhere near done to where, at least I don't think we're nowhere near where we want to be with our students.
Yeah. And I think what we can say is, I mean, obviously we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of IDEA. I think that just the overall idea that students are accepted, there's more inclusivity in schools. Students are within the general ed population, even though they might have more moderate severe disabilities, and they are integrated fully with other students. That, that's something to be celebrated, is that all of our students are able to be, educated together. And obviously 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. So, I think that is something to celebrate. And I think, like what you were saying, ongoing training, ongoing support, investment in our teachers, investment in our students. So we just have to find a money tree.
Right. And with that being said, I think we are done with this episode.
Yes, we are.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Mosaic Days. I'm Leonard Martinez.
And I'm Allison. Have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you for watching us.